The paramedics said my husband had been on the kitchen floor for at least 3 hours before I walked through that door. 3 hours. The soup he'd been heating was burned black to the bottom of the pot. The smoke alarm had tripped and reset itself, and the dog had pushed his water bowl against Raymond's shoulder and stayed there. Just stayed there, like he was trying to keep him warm. I stood in the doorway with my overnight bag still in my hand and couldn't make a sound. That comes later, the sound. First, there is just the terrible arithmetic of it. The clock on the microwave, the burned pot, the dog, the stillness of a man you have shared 31 years with lying on the floor of the kitchen he built himself from raw lumber in 1994. What I did not know, what I would not begin to understand for another 11 days, was that someone in that house had been waiting for exactly this to happen. And that the moment I called 911, a plan that had been running quietly in the background of my marriage for 4 years went into motion without a single sound. I need to tell you how I found out. I need to tell you what I found in the drawer of his workbench, and what was inside the envelope with his name on it, and what Raymond said to me when he finally woke up in that hospital bed and looked at me with those steady gray eyes of his and said, very quietly, "Ellen, there's something I haven't told you, and I think it's time." But to understand that, you need to understand who Raymond Calder is. Because nobody who watched him collapse on that kitchen floor, nobody who saw him being loaded into the ambulance, nobody who sat in that waiting room would have known what they were really looking at. Raymond turned 68 in March. He is the kind of man who has worn the same style of work boot since 1987. Wolverines, brown, steel-toed, resoled twice. He drives a 2003 Silverado with 214,000 miles on it and a crack in the dashboard that he has been meaning to patch with epoxy since 2019. He drinks his coffee black, no sugar, from a white ceramic mug that says Lake Erie Plumbing Supply on the side in faded blue letters. A promotional mug from a company that closed 14 years ago. The kind of thing you keep not because it's special, but because it's yours. He wakes at 5:10 without an alarm. He reads the physical newspaper. He waters the tomatoes before he does anything else in the morning, even before the coffee, because his father taught him that plants don't wait for you to be ready. Raymond spent 33 years as a master plumber, the last 19 of those running his own company. He doesn't talk about what he built the way some men do, with chest and volume, and the need for you to understand its size. He talks about it the way he talks about the tomatoes, matter-of-factly, as something that needed doing and got done. He retired 4 years ago, sold the business to his foreman, Danny Reyes, and spent the first 6 months of retirement building a proper wood shop in the back of our property. He said he wanted to make furniture. He has made 2 chairs, 1 bookshelf, and a cradle for our granddaughter. He has also spent approximately 400 hours just organizing the shop, which I think is what he actually wanted all along. A space with everything in its place and a reason to be alone that nobody could argue with. He is not a dramatic man. He does not perform emotion. When his brother died 3 years ago, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I told him, and then he said he was going to go finish the dovetail joints on the bookshelf. And he did. And he came in for dinner at 6, and after dinner he said, "Phil would have made fun of that bookshelf. He always said I measured twice and cut 3 times." And then he went to bed. That was the whole of it. And it was enough, because with Raymond, it is always enough. I had known this man for 34 years. I had been married to him for 31. I believed, with the confidence of someone who has shared a bathroom and a bank account and 2 children and 11 moves and a dog with a man for 3 decades, that I understood him completely. I was right about who he was. I was wrong about what was happening around him. The trip had been to my sister Carol's in Columbus. 4 days. She'd had a minor surgery, Her husband was traveling for work, and I'd gone to help her with the house and the recovery. Raymond had driven me to the airport himself, which he didn't need to do, but always did. He'd carried my bag to the check-in counter, even though it had wheels. He'd said, "Call me when you land." He always said that. I always did. I called when I landed. He answered on the second ring. He sounded fine. I called every evening. He sounded fine.
On the third night, he sounded a little tired, but he said it was just the heat. We'd had an early September heat wave pushing up into the low 90s, and that he'd been out in the shop most of the day, which tires him more than it used to, which is something he says with a kind of wry annoyance that I find deeply reassuring, because it means he's still arguing with his own body rather than surrendering to it. On the fourth morning, Carol was doing well enough that I booked an earlier flight home. I didn't call Raymond to tell him. I thought I'd surprise him. I thought it would be nice. The door was unlocked, which it shouldn't have been. The smoke smell hit me before I was fully inside, and then I saw him. The paramedics were professional and calm in the way that people are when they deal with emergencies as a matter of routine. It was frightening and also, somehow, steadying. They got him on a stretcher.
His eyes were open but unfocused, and he said something I couldn't hear, and one of the paramedics said, "Sir, can you tell me your name?" And Raymond said, very slowly and clearly, "Raymond Allen Calder." And I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been clenching. He had had a stroke. Mild, they said, which is a word that does a lot of heavy lifting, because nothing about watching the paramedics work on your husband on your kitchen floor feels mild. But they used it, and the neurologist named Dr. Ferris used it later, with more specificity and more genuine reassurance behind it. And by the end of the first night, I had recalibrated my terror into something more like a very serious, very focused dread. He would recover. Full or nearly full function. But recovery would take weeks. He would need rest. He would need someone watching him. He would need to not do the things that Raymond Calder has done every day of his adult life, which is to say, he would need to be still. I called our son David that first night. He lives in Charlotte with his wife Becca and their daughter Lily, who is 4 and very serious, and has her grandfather's gray eyes and his particular way of tilting her head when she's thinking that makes me ache sometimes with the recognition of it. David said he'd drive up the next morning. I told him not to, that his father would be embarrassed. And then I told him, yes, please come. I called our daughter Marissa in Portland. She cried. She offered to fly home. I told her to wait and see. I didn't call anyone else that night. I sat in the chair next to Raymond's bed until visiting hours ended, and then I drove home. And then I went to the kitchen and looked at the burned pot for a long time. And then I cleaned it. He was in the hospital for 6 days. I was there every hour that they would let me be.
I watched the nurses and the technicians and Dr. Ferris with an attention that surprised even me. I am not, by nature, a detailed observer of medical things. But I found I needed to understand everything that was happening, every number on every monitor, every change in procedure, every small improvement. Raymond is a man who diagnoses. He always has been. When something breaks, he doesn't panic. He looks at it. He traces the problem to its source. He asks what it's telling him. I had spent 31 years watching him do this, and now I was trying to do it myself with a situation I did not have the training for. And I kept thinking, he would not do this the way I'm doing this. He would be calmer. He would look harder. He woke up, really woke up, eyes clear, aware, on the third day. He looked at me, and then around the room, and then back at me, and he said, "The tomatoes need watering." I said, "David is doing the tomatoes." He said, "David overwaters." I said, "I know." I told him that. He did it anyway. Raymond closed his eyes briefly. Of course he did. That was when I knew he was going to be all right. David was there by the fourth day, sitting in the other chair, reading a book he wasn't really reading, glancing up at his father every few minutes, in a way that reminded me so much of what Raymond does when he's watching something he's not sure about that I had to look away. Becca had stayed home with Lily. Raymond had asked that specifically. He didn't want Lily seeing him in the hospital. He said it in a way that made it clear it was not a discussion. On the fifth day, Raymond said, "Ellen, I need to tell you something." I said, "Rest first." He said, "I've been resting for 5 days. Sit down." I sat down. He said, "There's a folder in the workbench, second drawer from the bottom, behind the router bits. I need you to go home and get it. Don't open it yet, just bring it." I looked at him. "What's in the folder?" He looked back at me for a long moment. His face was the same as it always is. Not expressionless, but controlled, composed, like a level, I always thought. Raymond's face is always level. "Things that are going to be hard to look at," he said, "but things you need to see." I want to be precise about the moment I found the folder, because I have replayed it many times since, and the order of things matters. I went home that evening after visiting hours. David had offered to come with me. I think he felt the weight of what his father had said, even though Raymond had been careful not to explain it to him. But I told him to stay at the hotel and rest. I drove home alone. The shop was unlocked because Raymond never locks it. He says there's nothing in there worth stealing except time, and no one can steal that.
I turned on the overhead light, fluorescent tubes that take a moment to commit, buzzing and blinking before they settle, and stood there in the smell of sawdust and machine oil, which is a smell I have always associated with safety and the deep satisfaction of someone doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The workbench is 8 feet long, solid oak, built by Raymond 2 years ago, and perfectly level in a way that he checked no fewer than 4 times before he was satisfied. 6 drawers on the right side. I went to the second drawer from the bottom and pulled it open. Router bits in a foam insert, neatly organized by diameter. Behind the insert, pushed all the way to the back, a manila folder, thick, held shut with a single rubber band. I almost opened it then. I wanted to. But Raymond had said not to. And in 31 years, I had learned that when Raymond says a thing with that particular quietness, it is not a request. I brought it back to the hospital the next morning.
David was already there. Raymond looked at the folder in my hands and then looked at David. "Dave," he said, "could you give us a few minutes?" David looked at me. I nodded. He got up and went to the hallway, pulling the door partly shut behind him. Raymond reached out his hand. I gave him the folder. He set it on his lap, removed the rubber band, opened it, and then handed it back to me. "Start at the top," he said. If I try to explain what was in that folder in the order that I read it, I lose the sense of what it felt like, which was not like reading, exactly, but more like standing in a room you have lived in for years and watching the walls slowly become something else. Nothing moved. Everything changed. The first document was a letter, printed on plain paper, no letterhead. It was addressed to someone named Marcus Tyrell, care of a P.O. box in a town I had never heard of in central Ohio. It was dated 14 months ago. It was signed with my husband's name, except that Raymond had not written it. I knew his handwriting, and I knew his language, and I knew, with the particular certainty that comes from 31 years of reading a person's notes on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the margins of the instruction manuals he saves because you never know, that he had not written this letter. The sentences were his sentences, almost. The vocabulary was close. But there was something off in the construction. A flatness, a performance of his voice rather than the thing itself. The letter discussed a financial arrangement. It mentioned a piece of property, a storage unit facility on the east side of Columbus, 47 units, commercial lease, and referred to a transfer of partial interest and agreed consideration in a way that was technically coherent but vague enough to mean several things, none of them clear. I looked up from the letter. Raymond was watching me with the same steady, quiet attention he gives to everything he is trying to understand. "Your signature," I said. "Yes." "But you didn't—" "No." I went back to the folder. The second document was a copy of a signature page. Not a whole document, just the last page, with 2 signature lines. One line had Raymond's signature on it, or what was meant to look like Raymond's signature. The other line was blank. The third document was a bank statement, not from our joint account, but from a business account I had never seen before, registered to something called RCA Holdings LLC, with an EIN I didn't recognize. The statement showed transactions going back 11 months. Small deposits, irregular. A few larger ones. The total balance at the bottom of the page was $63,411. I set the statement down on the bed. My hands were steady. I don't know how that was possible, but they were. I said, "Raymond."
"How long have you known about this?"
He said, 7 months, maybe a little more. 7 months. I wanted to be sure before I said anything, and then I got sick and— He stopped. He looked at the window. Outside, the September sun was doing what it does in Ohio in September, slanting low and golden, making everything look briefly more beautiful than it is. "I had the folder in case something happened to me," he said. "I needed you to know where to look." Here is what I would learn over the next 3 weeks, slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again, in the way that the mind refuses to absorb certain things at the pace they need to be absorbed. Our son-in-law, Kyle Brennan, had been using Raymond's name. Kyle married our daughter Marissa 6 years ago. He is 39 years old.
He works in commercial real estate, has always worked in commercial real estate, has always talked about commercial real estate the way some people talk about a religion they converted to as an adult, with an enthusiasm that doesn't quite conceal the effort behind it. He wore expensive watches. He mentioned Scottsdale and Phoenix a great deal. He said, "At the end of the day," at the beginning of many of his sentences, which was a thing that Raymond had mentioned to me once, very quietly, as though cataloging it for future reference. I had liked Kyle, I thought. Marissa was happy. Their apartment in Portland was beautiful. He seemed to work hard, to provide well, to treat our daughter with a kind of polished attentiveness that I had taken, without quite examining it, as affection. Raymond had been more careful in his assessments. "A man who tells you what he's worth," Raymond had said to me after our first Thanksgiving with Kyle, "is a man who needs you to know what he's worth." Those are different things. I had said, "Don't be uncharitable." He had said, "I'm not. I'm just reading the job." He was reading the job. He had been reading the job for 6 years, and when the job started going wrong, when Kyle began, quietly and carefully, to reach across the distance between Portland and our little house in Medina, Ohio, and to use Raymond's name and Raymond's credit history and Raymond's reputation as a licensed contractor in the state of Ohio to establish a business entity that Raymond knew nothing about, Raymond noticed. He noticed the way a plumber notices, not with alarm, but with a kind of professional recognition. He heard the sound that shouldn't be there. He traced it. The first thing he'd noticed was a call from a title company in Columbus, an automated message, the kind that thanks you for your business, that came to his cell phone 8 months ago. He hadn't used a title company. He had no business in Columbus.
He'd written the number down on the back of a hardware receipt. I found that receipt in the folder, too. And he'd called back the next morning. The woman at the title company had been friendly and slightly confused. She'd said she was following up on documents filed on behalf of RCA Holdings LLC. She'd said Mr. Calder's name appeared as registered agent. She'd said she was calling to confirm the address on file. Raymond had said, quietly and without any particular tension in his voice, that he wasn't familiar with that entity, but that he'd look into it and call back. He hadn't called back. He'd gone to the workbench instead. He'd started making notes. He told me all of this across 3 conversations, one in the hospital, one at the kitchen table 4 days after he came home, one in the shop where he sat in the old wooden chair that lives in the corner, and I sat on an overturned bucket the way I used to when we were first married, and I'd come out to where he was working just to be near him. He told it the way he tells everything, in sequence, without drama, with a great deal of quiet precision about what he knew versus what he suspected versus what he could prove. He had spent 4 months building a picture. He had done it the same way he'd done every complex job in 33 years of plumbing, by following the system. Every pipe leads somewhere. Every drain has a source. You don't assume, you trace. He had found the LLC registration through the Ohio Secretary of State website, which is public record. His name was there as registered agent, an address he didn't recognize, a business address in Columbus. He had found through a contact of Danny Reyes, Raymond's former foreman now knew everybody in the trades across 3 counties, the name of a notary who had apparently witnessed Raymond's signature on the LLC formation documents. Raymond had called that notary. The notary had not remembered the signing. The notary had been new, had been overwhelmed, had said the paperwork had all been in order when it came to her. She'd been apologetic and frightened. Raymond had thanked her gently and hung up. He had found the property, the storage unit facility, through a commercial real estate listing aggregator that Kyle had once mentioned by name at dinner, offhandedly, the way people mention tools of their trade. Raymond had typed the name of that aggregator into his browser. The browser history was in the folder, printed out, and searched for commercial listings in Columbus, near the registered address of RCA Holdings. The storage facility appeared in the results. It was listed as under contract. The listing agent's contact email had Kyle Brennan's name in it. "How did he get your signature?" I asked, in the kitchen, on the 4th day after Raymond came home. Raymond drank his coffee. He turned the mug in his hands, the Lake Erie plumbing supply mug, the same slow half-rotation he does when he's choosing words. "I think," he said, "it was the Morrison contract." 4 years ago, just before Raymond retired, he had signed a large commercial contract for a repiping job at a small apartment complex. A job he had bid on and won that had taken 14 months to complete. Kyle had visited that summer. Kyle had always been curious about Raymond's business, had asked questions, had seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of running a contracting company. Raymond had let him look at some paperwork, had walked him through the contract structure, had demonstrated on a printed page how Raymond Calder signed his name. Kyle had complimented his handwriting. Raymond had thanked him. He set down his coffee now. "I remember thinking it was an odd thing to comment on," he said, "the handwriting." I sat there. I looked at the man I married. I thought about 4 years of Sunday dinners and Christmases and a granddaughter with gray eyes. I thought about the phone calls to Portland, Marissa's voice easy and happy, talking about their apartment and her work and the weekend trips they took. I thought about Kyle at our Thanksgiving table, helping clear the dishes, asking Raymond about the wood shop with what had looked, in the soft light of that kitchen, exactly like genuine interest. "Raymond," I said. "I know," he said. "What do we do?" He looked at me steadily. He said, "We do what you do when you find a slow leak behind the wall. You don't rip out the whole house. You locate the source. You make sure you know exactly where it is. And then you fix it right."
If you've been listening to this kind of story for a while, and I think many of you have, then you know what it feels like when you realize the problem is not only the one you thought it was. You know that specific sensation, that moment when what you believed was the shape of the situation shifts, and you see that it is larger, or deeper, or has a different center than the one you were looking at. I want you to stay with me through the next part of this story, because it gets harder before it gets better, and I want to be honest about how hard it gets. If you're not already subscribed, if you found this channel recently and you're still not sure, I want to ask you to subscribe now. It costs you nothing. It matters to us more than you probably realize. Hit the like button while you're listening and leave a comment below. Have you ever discovered something about someone close to you that made you reread everything you thought you knew? Because that's what the next few weeks were like for us. That's what we're about to walk through. And I want you to come with us whole way. David knew something was wrong before we told him. He'd driven up from Charlotte and spent 2 weeks at a hotel nearby, coming to the house every morning, helping Raymond with the things Raymond couldn't yet do alone. Not that Raymond would acknowledge what those things were, but David had his father's practical intelligence and simply showed up and did them without announcing himself. He brought coffee. He sat in the kitchen. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. On the 11th day after Raymond came home, I sat down with David at the kitchen table and told him. He is 35 years old, our son. He has Raymond's structure and my coloring, brown hair which is starting to go at the temples, and he has a way, when he is processing something difficult, of going very still, the way Raymond goes still, except that where Raymond's stillness feels like a held breath, David's feels like something tightening. He sat across from me and read the folder, page by page, while I watched the light change in the kitchen. When he finished, he closed the folder. He didn't say anything for a while. "Marissa doesn't know?" he finally said. "No." "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," I said. "But no, I don't think so." He turned his head toward the window. Outside, Raymond was walking slowly along the garden bed, still a little unsteady, still under orders not to do anything strenuous, but unable to stay away from the tomatoes. He'd been out there for 20 minutes. "How do we do this?" David said. "Your father has a plan," I said. "He's been working on it." David looked back at me.
For 7 months.
For 7 months. There was a long pause. Of course he has, David said. I need to tell you about Matthew Oren. Raymond found him through a connection I wouldn't have thought to make. Danny Reyes, his former foreman, knew a construction attorney in Akron who had done work on a complex commercial fraud case 3 years earlier. That attorney's name was William Gareth, and William Gareth recommended Matthew Oren, who was a civil litigator in Columbus who specialized in identity-based commercial fraud. Raymond had called Matthew Oren from the shop on a Tuesday morning in early June while I was at Carroll's. Raymond did not tell me about that call until he was home from the hospital. When I asked him why he hadn't told me, he looked at me with that careful, level expression and said, "Because I didn't know yet what I had. I didn't want to bring you something I couldn't prove." Matthew Oren was 46, compact and methodical, with a way of speaking that reminded me a little of Raymond himself. Not in voice or manner, but in the quality of attention behind the words. He was not theatrical. He did not promise outcomes. He said what the evidence showed and what it might establish, and what it would take to establish it fully. And those were 3 different things, and he was careful about which was which. He had been working with Raymond for 6 months. He had obtained, through the Ohio Secretary of State's office, and through subpoenas Raymond had authorized, records of the RCA Holdings LLC formation, and of all documents filed under that entity. He had obtained, through a forensic document examiner, a retired FBI agent named Carol Deming, who worked out of Cleveland, an analysis of Raymond's signature on those documents. Carol Deming's conclusion, rendered in a 12-page report with exhibits, was that the signatures were not authentic. They were expert forgeries, close enough to pass a casual inspection, crafted by someone who had studied the original carefully. But they were forgeries. Her confidence level was described as very high. Matthew had also traced the financial flows of RCA Holdings. The $63,000 in that business account had a clear provenance. It had come, in installments, from an entity called Brennan Property Partners, LLC, a company registered in Oregon under Kyle's name. Raymond had not yet confronted Kyle. He had not told Marissa. He had been waiting, methodically, quietly, with the patience of a man who has spent 33 years understanding that a repair done wrong is worse than no repair at all, for the documentation to be complete. The stroke had interrupted that waiting.
I am going to tell you something about the weeks after Raymond came home that I find difficult to explain without sounding like I'm describing two different experiences happening in the same body at the same time. Because that is what it felt like. On the surface, we were simply a couple in their late 60s, managing a health recovery. Raymond doing his physical therapy exercises each morning at the kitchen table. The same 8 exercises in the same order, with the same slightly aggrieved expression that suggested he found them beneath him. Raymond walking in the evenings, 20 minutes at first, then 30, working back toward himself. Raymond in the shop, which he was forbidden from operating alone. Another instruction he found intolerable, but which he could sit in, and did, every afternoon, in the old wooden chair, with a book he was sometimes actually reading. And underneath that, running parallel, the folder. Matthew Oren. The question of Marissa.
I thought about my daughter constantly. I thought about her voice on the phone. Easy, happy. The voice of a woman who believes her life is what it appears to be. I thought about Lily, who calls Raymond Bump because she couldn't say Grandpa when she was learning to talk, and the name stuck. I thought about the last time Kyle had visited, 18 months ago, that Christmas, and how he'd sat at our dinner table and eaten the food Raymond smoked, and talked about a property development in Scottsdale, with the animated authority of a man who lives inside a world he has built himself. I thought about how Raymond had asked me, that Christmas, very quietly, in the kitchen while Kyle was in the living room with the children, whether I had ever noticed that Kyle never asked questions. I had said, "What do you mean?" Raymond had said, "He talks about what he knows. He doesn't ask about what he doesn't know. You can learn a lot about a person from what they're not curious about." I had thought at the time that Raymond was being uncharitable again. I thought about that a great deal. David drove back to Charlotte at the end of the second week after a long conversation with Raymond in the shop that I was not part of and did not ask about. He called me the next morning to say that he would come back when it was time, that he would bring Becca and Lily, that he was not going to say anything to Marissa because that was Raymond's call to make, and that he loved us. I told him his father was proud of him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know. He told me," which surprised me. Raymond does not typically tell people things like that. Matthew Oren called in the last week of October. He said the documentation was complete. He said he had spoken to a detective at the Columbus Metropolitan Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, a woman named Sloan, efficient and careful, who had been briefed on the case over the previous 2 weeks, and had confirmed that the evidence was sufficient to support a formal complaint. He said that if Raymond was ready, they could move forward. Raymond said he needed 1 week. That week he called Marissa. I was in the room for that call. I sat in the armchair in the living room, and Raymond sat on the couch, and he dialed our daughter's number, and when she answered, "Dad, how are you feeling? How's the recovery?" He said, "I'm well, sweetheart. Your mother is here. We need to talk to you about something, and it's going to be difficult, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." There was a pause. "Okay," she said. Her voice had changed. He told her. He told her the way he does everything, in sequence, with precision, without theater. He told her what he had found, and when, and what he had done about it. He told her about RCA Holdings, and the forged signatures, and the $63,000, and Matthew Oren and Carol Deming, and the Columbus Financial Crimes Unit. He told her in a single continuous explanation that lasted 22 minutes, and he did not stop once. And when he finished, he said, "Are you there?" There was a very long silence. Then Marissa said, in a voice I had never heard her use, controlled in a way that sounds like the opposite of control, like control that has been gripped too hard. "Lily is in the other room." "I know. I need to—" She stopped. "I'm going to put you on hold for a minute. Don't hang up." She came back in 6 minutes. Her voice was different again. Not calmer exactly, but resolved. She said, "What do you need me to do?" Raymond said, "Nothing right now. I just needed you to know." She said, "Dad." He said, "Yes, She said, "I'm sorry."
I'm so sorry that he... Don't, Raymond said. This is not on you. There is nothing on you. Do you understand me? A pause. Okay, she said. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. We'll talk more. Your mother is here. I said, Hi, sweetheart. She said, Hi, Mom. We sat on the line together for another minute, all three of us, not saying anything. Then Raymond said quietly, It's going to be all right. And I knew from the way he said it that he meant it in the specific way he means things. Not as reassurance, but as an assessment, a reading of the situation, a plumber's diagnosis. In the first week of November, Raymond and I drove to Columbus. Matthew Oren met us at his office, a spare, orderly room on the third floor of a building on South High Street, the kind of office that signals competence without trying to signal anything. He walked us through the formal complaint that had been filed with the Columbus Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Sloan had been in contact.
Kyle had not yet been formally contacted by investigators. Matthew also had prepared, on Raymond's instruction, a civil complaint. This was the document that Raymond had spent most of his planning energy on, the one Matthew had worked carefully to make airtight, the one that would, if Kyle did not settle, expose in formal legal proceedings not just the fraud itself, but the specific means by which it had been executed. The goal, Raymond had explained to me once, in the shop, in that quiet, level way, is not to punish him. I'm not interested in punishment. The goal is to make sure he can't use my name again, and to make sure Marissa has the leverage she needs to do what she needs to do. I had said, What does she need to do? He had looked at me steadily. Whatever she decides, he said, but she needs to decide from a position of information and not a position of blindness. We did not see Kyle that day. We did not go to Portland. Matthew had sent a letter via certified mail to Kyle's address in Portland, a letter that outlined, in precise legal language, the evidence that existed, the complaints that had been filed, and the nature of the civil claim being brought. The letter gave Kyle 10 days to respond through counsel. He responded in 3. I do not know what Kyle's attorney said to him when he saw the evidence. I don't know what he told Marissa, whether he tried to minimize it or explain it away, or whether he simply could not, because there is a point at which the documentation becomes its own argument, and there is no counter-argument that holds. I know that Marissa called Raymond on the 4th day after the letter was sent, and that she spoke to him for 40 minutes, and that Raymond sat at the kitchen table the whole time and did not say much, just listened, and occasionally said, yes, or I understand, or that's right. When he hung up, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he got up and went to the shop. I let him have an hour, then I brought him coffee. He was in the wooden chair, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. How is she? I asked. Angry, he said, which is right. Is she going to be okay? He took the coffee. He turned the mug in his hands, not the Lake Erie mug, one of the plain brown ones from the cabinet. She's the strongest of the 3 of us, he said. Always has been. She just didn't always know it. The settlement was finalized in January. Kyle would repay the full $63,000. Matthew had structured the payment schedule carefully, with collateral that made default consequential. The RCA Holdings LLC would be dissolved, and all filings made in Raymond's name would be